We are going to read chapter 1 of Alone. (1933) The Idea. Balling Advanced Weather Base, which I manned alone during the Antarctic winter night of 1934, was planted in the dark immensity of the Ross Ice Barrier, on a line between Little America and the South Pole. It was the first inland station ever occupied in the world's southernmost continent. My decision to winter there was harder, perhaps, than even some of the men at Little America appreciated. For the original plan had been to staff the base with several men, but as we shall presently see, this had proved impossible. In consequence, I had to choose whether to give up the base entirely, and the scientific mission with it, or to man it by myself. I could not bring myself to give it up. This much should be understood from the beginning, that above everything else, and beyond the solid worth of weather and auroral observations in the hitherto unoccupied interior of Antarctica, and my interest in these studies, I really wanted to go for the experience's sake. So the motive was in part personal. Aside from the meteorological and auroral work, I had no important purposes. There was nothing of that sort, nothing whatever, except one man's desire to know that kind of experience to the full, to be by himself for a while and to taste peace and quiet and solitude long enough to find out how good they really are. It was all that simple, and it is something, I believe, that people beset by the complexities of modern life will understand instinctively. We are caught up in the winds that blow every which way, and in the hullabaloo, the thinking man is driven to ponder where he is being blown, and to long desperately for some quiet place where he can reason undisturbed and take inventory. It may be that I exaggerate the need for occasional sanctuary, but I do not think so, at least speaking for myself, since it has always taken me longer than the average person to think things out. By that I do not mean to imply that, before I went to advanced base, my private life had not been extraordinarily happy. Actually, it had been happier than I had had right to expect. Nevertheless, a crowding confusion had pushed in. For 14 years or so, various expeditions, one succeeding the other, had occupied my time and thoughts, to the exclusion of nearly everything else. In 1919, it was the Navy's transatlantic flight. In 1929, Greenland. In 1926, the North Pole. In 1927, the Atlantic Ocean. 1928 to 30, the South Pole. In 1933 to 35, the Antarctic again. In between, there was no rest. An expedition was hardly finished before I was engaged in putting a new one together. And meanwhile, I was lecturing from one end of the country to the other in order to make a living and pay off the debts of the completed expedition, or else scurrying around to solicit money and supplies for a new one. You might think that a man whose life carries him into remote places would have no special need for quietude. Whoever thinks this has little knowledge of expeditions. Most of the time, they moved in fearful congestion and uproar, and always under the lash of time. Nor will they ever be different, so long as explorers are not rich men and so long as exploration itself deals with uncertainties. No doubt the world thinks it is a fine thing to reach one pole, or both poles, for that matter. Thousands of men have devoted the best part of their lifetimes to reaching one pole or the other, and a good many have died on the way. But among the handful who have actually attained latitude 90 degrees, whether north or south, I doubt that even one found the sight of the pole itself particularly inspiring. For there's little enough to see. At one end of the earth, a mathematical spot in the center of a vast and empty ocean, and at the other end, an equally imaginary spot in the middle of a vast and windy plateau. It's not getting to the pole that counts. It's what you learn of scientific value on the way, plus the fact that you get there and back without being killed. Now, I had been to both poles. In prospect, this had promised to be a satisfying achievement, and in a large sense it had been principally because the poles had been the means of enabling me to enlist public support for the full-scale scientific program, which was my real interest. The books of clippings which my family kept up grew fat, and most of them said good things. Hold on one second. Okay. Tangibles of success. At least in my profession, these, plus goodwill, were the visible assets. Although I should point out that the wisest among us, like conservative accountants, seldom carry the latter item in excess of $1. But for me, there was little sense of true achievement. Rather, when I finished the stock taking, I was conscious of a certain aimlessness. This feeling centered on small but increasingly lamentable omissions. For example, books. There was no end to the books that I was forever promising myself to read, but when it came to reading them, I seemed never to have the time or the patience. With music, too, it was the same way. The love for it, and I suppose the indefinable need, was also there, but not the will or the opportunity to interrupt for it more than momentarily the routine which most of us come to cherish as existence. This was true for other matters, new ideas, new concepts, and new developments about which I knew little or nothing. It seemed a restricted way to live. One might ask, why not try to bring these things into daily existence? Must you go off and bury yourself in the middle of polar cold and darkness just to be alone? After all, a stranger walking down Fifth Avenue can be just as lonely as a traveler wandering in the desert. All of which I grant, but with the contention that no man can hope to be completely free who lingers within reach of familiar habits and urgencies. Least of all a man in my position, who must go to the public for support and render a perpetual accounting of his stewardship. Now, it is undeniably true that our civilization has evolved a marvelous system for safeguarding individual privacy, but those of us who must live in the limelight are outside its protection. Now, I wanted something more than just privacy in the geological sense, or geographical sense. I wanted to sink roots into some replenishing philosophy. And so it occurred to me, as the situation surrounding advanced space evolved, that here was the opportunity. Out there on the South Polar Barrier, in cold and darkness as complete as that of the Pleistocene, I should have time to catch up, to study and think and listen to the phonograph, and for maybe 7 months, remote from all but the simplest distractions, I should be able to live exactly as I choose, obedient to no necessities but those imposed by wind and night and cold, and to no man's laws but my own. That was the way I saw it. There may have been more than that. At this distance, I cannot be sure, but perhaps the desire was also in my mind to try a more rigorous existence than any I had known. Much of my adult life had been spent in aviation. The man who flies achieves his destiny sitting down. Conflict, when it rises between the ship and the medium, comes to him indirectly, softened and stepped down by the mechanical advantage of the controls. When the conflict reaches the ultimate decision, the whole business is transacted one way or another in a matter of hours, even minutes and seconds. Where I was going, I should be physically and spiritually on my own. Where Advanced Base was finally planted, conditions are not very different from what they were when the first men came groping out of the twilight of the last ice age. That risks were involved, all of us knew, but none, please hold, as far as we could foresee, that were too great. Otherwise, as leader of a big polar expedition and subject to all the responsibilities implicit in command, I could not have gone. That I miscalculated is proved by the fact that I nearly lost my life. Yet I do not regret going, for I read my books, if not as many as I had counted on reading, and listened to my phonograph records, even when they seemed only to intensify my suffering, and meditated, though not always as cheerfully as I had hoped. All this was good, and it was mine. What I had not counted on was discovering how closely a man could come to dying and still not die, or want to die. That, too, was mine, and it also is to the good, for that experience resolved proportions and relationships for me as nothing else could have done. And it is surprising, approaching the final enlightenment, how little one really has to know or feel sure about. Now, I have started out in this vein because of a misunderstanding arose in some quarters concerning my reason for occupying Advanced Base alone. Indeed, some people disputed my right to do what I did. What people think about you is not supposed to matter much, so long as you yourself know where the truth lies. I have a feeling there's going to be a lot of cryptic things in this book. But I have found out, as have others who move in and out of newspaper headlines, that on occasion it can matter a good deal. For once you enter the world of headlines, you learn there is not one truth but two, the one which you know from the facts, and the one which the public, or at any rate, a highly imaginative part of the public, acquires by osmosis. It isn't often that the one person centrally involved ever hears about the second kind. His friends see to that. Nevertheless, I happen to be privy to several of the gospel truths circulating about Advanced Base. God knows there may be others, but these could hardly be improved upon. One is that I was exiled by my own men. Another is that I went out there to do some quiet but serious drinking. In the past, such tales would have shocked me. Most certainly they would have made me mad, but not now. The one criticism that might have given me pause was disposed of by my friend, Charles J. V. Murphy, a member of the expedition. Before leaving for Advanced Base, I asked him to look out for my affairs in collaboration with the second in command, Dr. Thomas C. Poulter. My announcement that I would occupy Advanced Base alone was not wirelessed to the United States until I was actually established there. It was simply that I was going because I wanted to go. My friends received the news with different emotions. Radio messages poured into Little America during the next 48 hours. Most of them were from men whose judgment I value. Considering the little that they had to go on, I must say that they were surpassingly fair. And yet, for every message of approval, there were three of puzzlement or forthright disapproval. I was urged, virtually ordered, to reconsider. My going off, they said, must end in disaster, almost certainly for myself and probably for the 55 men presumed to be left leaderless at Little America. The head of a great geographical institution warned that, if anything went wrong at Little America during my absence, my disgrace would be worse than that of Nobile, whose crime lay in leaving his shattered dirigible before all of his men were taken off. A banker friend said flatly that the whole idea was a reckless whim and that any shame in withdrawing would be more than offset by the escape from the consequences which must flow from my decision if I persisted in. All of these messages were addressed directly to me, but they went to Charlie Murphy. He was in a tough spot. The winter night was coming on, the cold was deepening, and I know that he himself was troubled on my account. He knew how close was my friendship to these men in America. To each man he replied that if I was where I was for a deliberate and useful purpose, that the tractors were on their way from Advanced Base back to Little America, and a return trip would expose other men to considerable risks, that in his opinion I was irrevocably resolved on my course, and that because of my psychological burdens were already heavy enough, he did not propose to add to them by informing me over the radio that my friends were in a panic. Therefore, the messages were being filed at Little America for my return in October. Then it was March, and 6 months of darkness and cold would meanwhile intervene. But all of this, of course, I had not even a hint. I am glad this was so, for I was human enough not to want to be misunderstood, at least by my friends. I wasn't big enough for that. In his radio conversations with me at the time, Murphy was always cheerful. He never mentioned what had happened. And for that matter, I never asked him what my friends thought, for the reason that I didn't want to know. I suspected, of course, that there would be criticism, but I couldn't do anything about that. My bridges were burned behind me. Whether I could have been persuaded to turn back if Murphy had passed those messages on is a matter I shall not undertake to answer. It would be stupid to do so. Hindsight has a way of inventing different compensations and motives. My only purpose in bringing the matter up now is to illustrate some of the misunderstandings that attended the manning of Advanced Base and the different pulls that rise inevitably to deter the man who tries something out of the ordinary. Advanced Base was no reckless whim. It was the outcome of 4 years of planning. The original idea came out of my first expedition to the Antarctic. It was an indirect byproduct of my interest in polar meteorology. Of all the different branches of science served by a soundly constituted polar expedition, on the last we served 22 branches. None to the popular mind has a more practical value than meteorology. The farmer whose livelihood comes from crops, the people whose stomachs are kept full by these crops, the speculators who gamble in them, the industrialist whose factories depend upon the farmer's purchasing power, the sailor on the seas. All these and others, even to the casual holiday tourist, have a vital stake in weather, but few of them appreciate the extent to which the poles enter into their local schemes. Most of us have a schoolboy's understanding of the theory of simple circulation, a cold current of air flowing inexhaustibly from the poles to the equator, a countercurrent of warm air returning poleward above it, and the two together creating the endlessly renewed interchange, which is the breathing of the globe. He said that. The extent to which the poles influence the weather is still a subject for speculation. Some authorities go so far as to say that each pole is the true weather maker in its respective hemisphere. This latter belief has been formulated in that person's theory of the polar front, which undertakes to explain atmospheric circulation in terms of the effects produced by the interaction of masses of polar cooled air, the so-called polar fronts, with the masses of warm equatorial air into which they intrude. Although a knowledge of polar meteorology is indispensable for enlightened long-range forecasting, we really know very little about it. AMOC, and because of the need for more information about the general laws of circulation, the first concern of an expedition leader is to see that his meteorological department is strongly staffed. This obligation has been earnestly met by most expeditions. The results, nevertheless, have been meager, for Antarctica has been under scientific investigation for less than half a century. And, so far as weather data are concerned, the bulk of the knowledge is represented by the work of perhaps a dozen well-founded expeditions. For a continent having an estimated area of 4,500,000 square miles, this is not much of a showing, or so it seemed to me. In the course of my first Antarctic expedition, I was struck by the thought that the most valuable source of meteorological data was still left untouched. What data existed had for the most part been collected at fixed bases on the Antarctic coast or on islands adjacent to the coast, by ships exploring contiguous waters, and by field parties poorly equipped for research, making fast summer dashes inland. Meteorologically, the interior of Antarctica was a blank. No fixed stations had ever been advanced inland. No winter observations had ever been made beyond the coast, and the fragmentary data collected by sledging parties covered only the comparatively mild summer months. Yet inland, beyond the moderating influence of the seas, which surround the continent, was the coldest cold on the face of the earth. It was there one must look for typical continental conditions, and it was there that I proposed to plant Advanced Base. There, where weather is manufactured. The data accumulated by a station like Advanced Base, when correlated with data gathered simultaneously at Little America, ought to throw a highly revealing light on the facts of atmospheric phenomena in high southern latitudes. Why should a civilization as technologically alert as ours continue to tolerate a situation that allows ruinous storms, kindled long before at remote storm centers, to break without adequate warning upon the civilized parts of the world? Only recently, Mr. Willis R. Gregg, chief of the United States Weather Bureau, predicted the establishment in the polar regions of robot observers, which would flash data by wireless. This is 1930. To stations in lower latitudes. This is tripping me out. That way, meteorologists could watch conditions as they develop in the main amphitheaters of meteorological action and plot their charts accordingly. I rather wish I had thought of that myself. Come on, one page. Because Advanced Base was intended to be the pilot station for a polar-wide system of similar outposts, except that it was to be manned by flesh and blood instead of a mechanical brain untroubled by cold and darkness and memory. Our original plan was decidedly a daring one. In the preliminary discussions with Bill Haynes, then, as on the second expedition, my senior meteorologist, I never pretended that the idea was more than speculative. In other words, great stuff, if we could do it. Excuse me, can I please... Where we finally decided to aim for... Give it back. Damn it. I apologize for that. In other words, great stuff, if we could do it. Where we finally decided to aim for was the foot of the Queen Maud Mountains. Even with that, we realized that we were probably overreaching ourselves. It meant hauling tons of supplies over some 400 miles across the crevice-ridden Ross Ice Barrier, and relying upon tractors whose capacities on barrier surface would have to be determined by guests and by God. In all aspects, particularly the psychological, the risks surrounding the project were very real. Whoever should elect to inhabit such a spot must reconcile themselves to enduring the bitterest temperatures in nature, a long night as black as that on the dark side of the moon, and an isolation which no power on earth could lift for at least 6 months. Now, against cold, the explorer has simple but ample defenses. Against the accidents, which are the most serious risks of isolation, he has inbred resourcefulness and ingenuity. But against darkness, nothing much but his own dignity. In the kind of station we had in mind, the normal risks of a polar base would be intensified 1,000-fold. The difficulties would be great. The amount of supplies that could be advanced would be small, and therefore only very few men could occupy it. Well, there's another reason to go alone. The men would be jammed together at arm's length in a tiny shack buried in the snow. Wind and cold would keep them from ever leaving it for more than a few hours a day. Change, in the sense that we know it, without which life is scarcely tolerable, would be non-existent. The party would be dedicated to an iron routine. The day would be the repeated pattern of the hour, the week, the repeated pattern of the day, and one would scarcely be distinguishable from the other, even as an interval in time. Where there is no growth or change outside, men are driven deeper and deeper inside themselves for materials of replenishment. And on these hidden levels of self-replenishment, which might be called the pay levels of philosophy, would depend the ability of any group of men to outlast such an ordeal and not come to hate each other. My idea was that 3 men, preferably 2 weather observers and a radio operator, should man the base. The difficulties of hauling supplies into the Antarctic interior made 3 the maximum, and the risks, especially those of a psychological disorder, argued forcefully against less than 3. 3 is a classic number. 3 men would balance each other like the legs of a tripod. With 3 men as compared to 2, the chances for temperamental harmony seemed infinitely increased, since in the nature of human relations, one man would constantly be present in the stabilizing role of a neutral judge, a court of appeal. Instead of hearing one voice everlastingly and seeing one face and being confronted with one pattern of habits, and idiosyncrasies, a man would have 2 aspects and personalities constantly facing him. Under such conditions, it doesn't take 2 men long to find each other out. And inevitably, this is what they do, whether they will it or not. If only because once the simple tasks of the day are finished, there's little else to do but take each other's measure. Not deliberately, not maliciously, but the time comes when one has had nothing left to reveal to the other, when even his unformed thoughts can be anticipated. His pet ideas become a meaningless drool, and the way he blows out a pressure lamp, or drops his boots on the floor, or eats his food becomes a rasping annoyance. And this could happen between the best of friends. Men who have lived in the Canadian bush know well what happens to trappers paired off this way. And mindful of these facts, I resolved from the beginning not to have Advanced Base a 2-man project. Even at Little America, I knew of bunkmates who quit speaking because each suspected the other of inching his gear into the other's allotted space. and I knew of one who could not eat unless he could find a place in the mess hall out of sight of the Fletcherist who solemnly chewed his food 28 times before swallowing. In a polar camp, little things like that have the power to drive even disciplined men to the edge of insanity. During my first winter in Little America, I walked for hours with a man who was on the verge of murder or suicide over imaginary persecutions by another man who had been his devoted friend. For there is no escape anywhere. You are hemmed in on every side by your own inadequacies and the crowding pressures of your associates. The ones who survive with a measure of happiness are those who can live profoundly off their intellectual resources, as hibernating animals live off their fat. Occupied by 3 men of this sort, advanced base should not be too difficult to place. So I reasoned, in all events. During the months that followed the return of the first expedition, the idea was continually challenging my imagination. Since the idea wouldn't down, I made a serious study of the practical possibilities. Well in advance of the mobilization of the second expedition, late in 1933, 4 of us started working on the base. One man was Victor, a warrant officer assigned to me by the Marine Corps. Another was Paul Sipple. Both had served on the first expedition and knew the problems to be overcome. C's job was to design the shack, which would be the base, and Sipple's was to study and collect the essential materials required for it. The actual building of the shack was done by Ivor Tingloff, a cabinet maker in a Boston loft. And when the Jacob Ruppert, flagship of my second expedition, put out from Boston in October 1933, she carried secreted in the hold the cunningly contrived knockdown sections of a 3-man shack. In the hold also were 4 tractors, which would be available for lugging the base into the interior. Except for Haynes, the builders, and myself, nobody else aboard had more than a dim suspicion of what that shack was for. I had said little about it. Experience having taught me that the polar regions sooner or later will chasten the best laid plans. While I had a number of men under consideration for the base, including several whose quality I knew well from the first stay at Little America, I had actually decided on none. The 15,000-mile sea voyage, by the course we had set, would provide ample opportunity to study and weigh the candidates. As for myself, time and circumstances would decide. At first, I rather thought I had no right to put my own name in nomination. Having whipped an expedition together in the midst of the Depression, naturally I owed a whale of a lot of money. I was in command of 2 ships, 4 airplanes, and 100 men, so the chances of my being able to drop responsibilities did not look promising. On the other hand, it was hard to see how a leader could ask 3 other men to volunteer for a risk he was not prepared to take himself. Of the long voyage to Little America, I shall not attempt to write. It has been adequately described, I think, in Discovery. My general account of the expedition, after a sortie into the ice-strewn and fog-bound seas off the still undiscovered coast to the eastward of Little America, we finally steamed into the Bay of Whales on January 17, 1934. There we had our first glimpse into the appalling ice conditions that were to have a profound bearing upon all our proposed operations. Although masses of loose broken ice jammed the spacious entrance to the bay, we were able to push the ship to within 3 miles of Little America. 3 miles, that is, as the squawgle flies. But in between, following the eastern shore of the bay, was a mile-wide belt of pressure ice, with wave upon wave of upheaved and broken ice, shot through with deep crevices, pits, and open water leads with bottom 350 fathoms down. Unless you have seen pressure, you cannot imagine what it is like. The belt which blocked us off from Little America made me think of a hurricane-whipped sea, petrified at the height of the blow. It was 40 feet from the crests of some of the waves to the troughs. If that were all, the situation might not have been half bad, but the tides and currents were ceaselessly working on the bottom of the ice. You could hear it groaning and heaving in a dozen different places, and a spot that would offer safe transit one day would be a gaping crevice by the next. After surveying the region, both by airplane and with exploring parties on skis, we came to the gloomy conclusion that not even the dog teams, much less the tractors, could safely pass through to Little America. Indeed, we were on the verge of abandoning Little America entirely and building a new base on the west shore of the Bay of Whales, when a skiing party returned with the news that they had charted a passage through, though it was a good 7 miles long and full of potential hazards. That passage we took, dreading the alternative of building a new main base on the other side of the bay. Misery Trail was the name we gave it, and the name was an understatement. For 2 whole months, 24 hours a day, we flogged between the ships in Little America, shifting the passage to meet the rapidly altering ice conditions, throwing bridges across the worst crevices, while the sea pounded the ice at our backs. Some days, the midnight sun, making its unhurried round of the sky, was with us all the time. Then it was warm enough for the men to strip to the waist, while the dogs, of which we had 150, suffered from the heat and floundered waist-deep in snow, turned soft. But most of the time, it was not like that at all. The blizzards came shouting in, filling the air with drift, and blinding the tractor drivers and the sledgers, who felt their way along the range flags marking the transit. Almost always there was fog, the pale, mischievous fog of the Bay of Whales, which is like no other fog I have ever seen, almost milky in consistency, but turning the snow and atmosphere into a flat plain where all proportions are horribly twisted, and imparting to a traveler the queer feeling that he is treading the bottom of a heavy ocean. But of Misery Trail I shall write no more. How we hauled 650 tons of supplies into Little America has been described at length in Discovery, though you may read the chapters without ever feeling the utter exhaustion that claimed us. An exhaustion so deep that it sent men stumbling on errands they could not remember when they reached their objectives, and reddened their eyes with sleeplessness, and numbed their bodies against cold, and dropped them in their tracks from exhaustion. Anyhow, after a long time, the ships went away. Then one midnight the sun popped for an instant below the horizon, and each night thereafter set a little bit earlier. Then the caches on the trail were empty. Then Little America was being rebuilt and reoccupied. And for the first time in what seemed like 1,000 years, I was able to give thought to the matter of advanced base. By then it was almost too late. March had come. The winter was close upon us. The unbroken night was scarcely 6 weeks away, and I was surrounded by men whose strength had been sapped almost to the limit. All this time, the advanced base shack, transported with the utmost care through the pressure, had been standing in the center of Little America. Paul Sipple had taken possession to test out the ventilating and heating equipment. Now that I had time for serious reconsideration, it did not take long to reach one conclusion, which was that wherever we did finally succeed in planting the base, it would not be at the foot of the Queen Maud's or anywhere near it. First, time was running against us. Here it was March, with the temperatures dropping through the minus 20s, 30s, and even 40s. In March, your Antarctic field parties are normally swinging towards home, racing the oncoming night. Secondly, the 4 tractors, which were relying upon to advance the base, had been driven almost to rack and ruin on Misery Trail, and a thoroughgoing overhaul was in order before the fleet could be sent out on the barrier. Dogs were of no use to us in this journey. The pick of the pack had gone with Captain Innes Taylor on a base-laying journey for next season's southern operations. But even if the remaining dogs had been in good shape, they still could not have transported unaided to the 7 tons of material and stores needed for the base. Airplanes might have been used as freighters, but that idea went by the broad when the Fokker crashed on a test hop and was washed out completely. That left us with 2 planes capable of carrying any sort of load: the twin-engined Condor and the single-engined Pilgrim. I wouldn't use the Condor. If anything happened to her, our entire exploration program might be ruined. The Pilgrim I tried to use for relaying lighter loads, but after emergency rations and equipment had been stowed aboard for the flight crew and a safe margin of gas included, the payload was too slight to be of much use. Even so, it might have used the ship for what she was worth, had not the weather turned bad. The crew, returning from an experimental flight, got lost in a fog, very, very narrowly missing a crash, and it took a whole day to find them. After that experience, I determined not to risk any more men in the air, nor the 1 airplane available for reserve duties. Therefore, if advanced base was to be advanced a foot beyond Little America, it would have to be by tractors. How far the tractors could push would depend in turn on how quickly Demas was able to complete the overhauling of the engines and the Caterpillar mechanisms, besides rebuilding 1 machine which had been partially destroyed by fire. I, for one, was not particularly optimistic as to the outcome. 3 of these machines were 10 to 20 Citroens, I don't know how to pronounce that, acquired in France. The runs over Misery Trail had demonstrated that they were definitely underpowered for day in and day out barrier travel. The 4th was a 20 to 40 cell track made in the United States. All were short. All, particularly the 6-ton cell track, were heavy, which shortcomings made them vulnerable to crevices. So the trip was a gamble, no matter how I looked at it. This was the first serious attempt to operate automotive equipment in the Antarctic. The risks were the inevitable risks of pioneering. No one could tell how well the engines would function in temperatures down to 60 below zero, or how the caterpillar treads would work on a snow surface which cold granulates to the fineness of sand, or whether the machines could penetrate creviced areas. If the fleet made a southing of 200 miles, it would be performing a miracle, I decided. and I was ready to settle for 150 miles, less if necessary, so long as the journey could be made without undue hardships for the men. Yet we were not allowed to prepare in peace. When I recall the events that preceded this start, I wonder that we came off with as little lasting damage as we did. Young John Dyer, chief radio engineer, plunged 45 feet from the top of the antenna pole with no worse hurt than a barked shin. Rawson, the navigator, had to be operated on for a streptococcus throat infection. Then Pelter, the aerial photographer, came down with appendicitis. This meant another hasty operation under conditions made melodramatic by the doctor's unwitting act. Knocking over a lamp, he set fire to the cache in which all the surgical instruments were stored. All hands were wildly mustered to save the instruments and a dozen sleeping men who were in danger of being trapped in the adjoining shack. And this happened just a day or so after the Fokker had crashed in full view of the camp, and 4 men, stunned but otherwise unhurt, had crawled out from the wreckage. Breaking rapidly, one on top of the other, these incidences, any one of which might have been fatal, rasped nerves already drawn taut by the exhausting demands of Misery Trail. We were ready to find anything under the bed. In this mood, we jumped one day to the grim conclusion that Little America was on the verge of breaking loose from the Antarctic continent and drifting into the Ross Sea as a calving iceberg. Little America is actually a city on a raft. The 300-foot thickness of ice on which it rests is pocketed in the coastal reach of the Ross Ice Barrier, whose sheer cliffs in places rise to 150 feet above sea level. Partly floating free, partly resting on deep submarine reefs and shoals. And elsewhere, riding over the land, this gigantic barrier fronts the ocean for 400 miles and also extends inland clear to the foot of the Queen Maud Mountains. It is not fixed in the sense that land is fixed. It is, in effect, an enormous glacier, wide enough to blanket the Atlantic seaboard states. And, like a glacier, it is forever creeping towards the sea, propelled from behind by the massive rivers of ice pouring down through the mountain passes from the polar plateau. The coastal edges tend to bulge out over the sea until the sheer weight of the projecting shelf or the violent pressure of the tide and storm causes great strips to break off. In this way, the vast fleets of icebergs which patrol the ocean approaches to Antarctica are created. We had seen these products of the continental disintegration. In the course of the voyage through the Devil's Graveyard, far to the north and east of Little America, we had counted no less than 8,000 bergs in a single day, some of them 20 miles long. I don't think that any of us will ever forget what it was like in the Devil's Graveyard. The sunless corridors of waste waters, the fog that sometimes thinned but never lifted, the crash of the gales, and occasionally over that uproar the heavier sound of bergs capsizing in the storm. And everywhere those stricken fleets of ice, bigger by far than all the navies in the world, wandering hopelessly through a smoking gloom. Through this ambush, the ship groped and sidestepped like a lost creature, harried by enemies her lookouts rarely saw full view, but only as dark and monstrous shadows sliding through the fog. The engine room telegraph bells never stopped ringing, and months after some of us would start out of a sound sleep, braced for the impact which we could not forever expect to avoid. With the spell of that region upon us, the realization that Little America might itself be destined to join the ghost fleets to the north was enough to shake us out of our wariness, for Little America was barely 3/4 of a mile from the water's edge. Ever since our arrival in January, the new, or bay ice, in the Bay of Whales had been breaking up with unprecedented speed. Toward the end of February, when from experience we had reason to expect a freeze, the pace of the breakup quickened instead. The pressure ice started to go, and with it went the ice cementing, which held that stretch of barrier in position. Huge cracks opened up all around Little America. Each day they gaped a little wider. At night, when everything was quiet, one could sometimes feel the floor of one's shack heaving gently from the swell, pulsing against the ice basement hundreds of feet underneath. Fierce storms in the ocean to the north were apparently responsible. The waves continually smashing against the coast were breaking up the old ice in the new ice as fast as it formed. With Dr. Poulter, senior scientist, I took a long trip in a tractor along the barrier crest to the north and east. The sound of the seas 60 feet below us was like thunder, and at least once, when the car was stopped, we heard far off the tremendous whoosh of a huge stretch of barrier give way. We were worried, make no mistake about that. We were worried because we honestly didn't know what was coming and couldn't stop it if it did come. So I did an extraordinary thing. I summoned the entire winter party into the mess hall, where I laid before them the facts, inviting every man to have his say on the steps, if any, which we should take. The outcome was a decision to continue as we were on the assumption that Little America would last, but at the same time to move approximately 1/3 of our stores to High Barrier, a mile or so to the southeast. If Little America did go out, we should then have a handy place to scramble to, with enough supplies cached to carry us through a winter. And if it didn't go out, there wouldn't be too much stuff to haul back. So for a couple days, we forgot everything else to haul gasoline, coal, food, clothing, and other gear to retreat camp. To hurry it up, I had Dema's tractor hauled out to the repair shop and pressed into service. All this had a bearing upon the fate of Advance Base. Time was lost that could not be redeemed, and the energies of the men were depleted by that much more. The pity is that it seemed like so much labor lost. No sooner were we done than the seas abated, the outrush of the ice ceased, and the freeze-up set in almost at once. Warily, the tractor men returned to the preparations. At midnight on February 15th, by the light of gasoline flares, the advanced base shack was dismantled, and the sections were piled on 2 tractor sledges. Next afternoon, the 4 tractors moved out of Little America in echelon. Trundling behind each was a string of sledges loaded down with food and fuel and meteorological gear and books and clothes and tools and all the other countless things required to defend existence in a place which offers nothing to man but air to breathe. Ahead of them ran a 178-mile lifeline through the heart of the barrier, which had been flagged and scouted by Ince Taylor's Southern Party, then making ready for their turnaround and homeward journey. 9 men made up the party, including Sipple and Tingloff, the carpenter who had built the hut in Boston. June and Demes were in joint command. Both were optimistic. I was not. Watching the column creep up the long white slope to the south, I was conscious only of misgivings. Although the sledges were loaded to the gunwales, a careful inventory of the supplies that we were leaving showed that they were insufficient for 3 men, and that, unless a second round trip could be made before the winter night, our plans for manning the base would have to be drastically changed. But before committing myself to any decisions, I would wait and see.